latest in the Saloom Chair speaker series. I'd like to get our familiar faces and maybe even more so to see a few unfamiliar faces. As many of you know, the title of the panel today is Jefferson versus Hamilton, Rival Visions of American Politics. And some of my students will not be surprised to hear that my favorite letters in the title of the panel are V and S. The old Latin word versus, abbreviated VS, meaning opposition, contestation, rivalry. That's what the panel is about. And I wanted to say a few words before introducing our speakers about the history of this rivalry and the history of our understanding of this rivalry. Many people may not realize that there was a time in American politics when the opposition between Jefferson and Hamilton was widely understood by politically active citizens. And more than that, it was considered to be part of the basic fabric of the two-party system in this country. So just to give an easy and convenient example, consider the two presidents Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican Party president of the early 20th century. He was very fond of praising one of his political heroes, Alexander Hamilton. And Franklin Roosevelt, by contrast, a Democratic president, specifically by name, sort of downgraded and dissed Hamilton and claimed that his politics were fundamentally Jeffersonian. And these two examples are, it's a small n, as we say in political science, a small number of examples, but they indicate something that was pretty routine in American politics. Hamilton was considered to belong to the Republican Party for many generations, and Jefferson to the Democratic Party. Now, obviously, in 2018, that's not the world of American politics that we still inhabit. Things have changed. Some people say one of the things that's changed is we don't really care as much or understand as well the nature of the opposition or the nature of the rivalry, and that may be true. But what's really interesting is even among people who are politically active and well-informed and really care about what Jefferson and Hamilton stood for and where their differences lay, even among those people, things have changed. Jefferson is no longer the unquestioned figurehead of the Democratic Party. And those of you who are into local and state politics may know that in recent years, the Democratic Party of Louisiana took Jefferson's name off of their annual fundraising dinner because he's not quite kosher for what the party stands for anymore, according to many in the Democratic Party. But consider Hamilton as well. The views of Hamilton have been changing also. Many of you know the Broadway musical. Some of you know the biography by Ron Chernow, which is said to have inspired the musical. And many people come away from those works with an impression that Hamilton, he was kind of a center-left, vaguely progressive guy. And some Democrats actually identify more with Hamilton nowadays than with Jefferson. I've even seen some commentary on newspaper websites that suggests, from the Republican side, from the right of the political spectrum, if the Democrats want to give up Hamilton, the Republicans should grab him and claim him. And so we're looking at a kind of a topsy-turvy world from the perspective of the way things used to be, where not only do people not care as much in some quarters about Jefferson versus Hamilton, but their roles with respect to the major parties in the United States might actually be inverted. And so we could be seeing the signs, perhaps, that in the future, Democrats will say, we are the party of Hamilton, not Jefferson, and Republicans might say the opposite. And that would be a pretty dramatic thing, at least looking over the long run of history. I don't think we expect the Raging Cajun football team to run out on the field next fall wearing purple and gold. That seems pretty unlikely, but it's much less unlikely to imagine that what Jefferson and Hamilton mean to American politics could be sort of flip-flopped. Now, I'm trying to be provocative, of course, and maybe the trends will not go that far. Maybe it's just a cultural fad, the way some Right of center people are taking to Jefferson, and some left of center people are taking to Hamilton. But those are some of the questions that we're going to try to get at today. And of course, if we want to understand those sorts of things, we've got to reacquaint ourselves with these historical figures, with what they stood for, with why they disagreed so vehemently in the early years of the American Republic, with what areas were covered by disagreement between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and what areas weren't. So we're going to try to figure out what it was all about and if it's still relevant to us today. And our two guests, I really can't think of two better scholars today for helping us think through these issues about Jefferson and Hamilton specifically. So first of all, to my immediate left, we have Dr. Carson Holloway. He's a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He's also a visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and he has written in the past couple of years a new book on Jefferson and Hamilton. That would be this one right here, Hamilton versus Jefferson in the Washington Administration, Completing the Founding or Betraying the Founding. And I mentioned the recent book, passing over several scholarly articles in journals and edited volumes as well. I should mention that Dr. Holloway is the co-editor of a new edition of Alexander Hamilton's political writings coming out with Cambridge University Press. So that's something for Hamilton scholars and others interested in the American political tradition to look forward to. On my far left, purely figuratively, of course, as well as literally, we have Dr. Andrew Shankman from the Department of History, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers U-Camden. He also holds a position of great interest, I think, and utility within the historical profession of book review editor at the Journal of the Early Republic. So he's very well versed, as some of Dr. Kim's students found out in a class visit yesterday, very well versed in all kinds of recent books on the American Revolution and the early Republic before the Civil War. Dr. Shankman himself has contributed one such book. Here it is. It's called Original Intents, just out within the past year. The subtitle is Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and the American Founding. This is an exciting contribution in addition to his previous book on Jeffersonian politics in Pennsylvania, as well as numerous scholarly articles in journals and a couple of co-edited books as well. So I'm really pleased that these two distinguished scholars could join us, and let's please give them a warm, raging Cajun welcome. A word about the format and the timing. Each speaker is going to take about 20 minutes. I'm going to begin with Dr. Shankman to present the Jeffersonian perspective on this debate.
Actually, we're thinking maybe he should go first, because then...
Oh,
yeah,
is that okay?
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
I defer to I'm outvoted 2-1. I'm not sure what Hamilton would think of that procedure, but anyway, Dr. Holloway will proceed first, presenting the Hamiltonian perspective on this great debate, followed by Dr. Shankman to present the Jeffersonian perspective, and after that I will stand back up and sort of moderate the Q&A. As everyone knows, I think the Q&A is always a robust and exciting part of these events. I will also tell you that toward the end of our program, around about 12:15 or so, catering will be rolling in some free food at the very back of the room, and so we can all sort of attack with the free food after the end of the proceedings up here up front. So I'll begin with Dr. Shankman, Dr. Holloway, with the Hamiltonian perspective.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction, and I want to thank you for having us here. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, not only as the guest of your fine university, but also in a way as kind of an ambassador of Hamilton and Jefferson. Not that I mean that it's my job to defend everything about Hamilton or Jefferson, but they're formidable men, and they're still very interesting minds. I mean, they're formidable in terms of their intellect and their exertions on behalf of the country, so I just feel like it's a lucky break to be able to study them and and to come and talk about them. What I want to discuss in my remarks this morning as a kind of introduction to Hamilton's political significance is his Treasury program, or the set of policies he wanted to get enacted and somewhat got enacted as Secretary of the Treasury. And that could appear dull in a way. I sometimes think this is like green eye shade stuff, Secretary of the Treasury work, but I don't think it's dull. I think it does open up on some pretty big issues. And one way of introducing that I wanted to attempt here was to read just a passage from the Federalist Papers, from Federalist 11, where Hamilton was talking about commercial policy and the importance of the Union in relation to regulating America's foreign commerce. So I'll read this passage and then make a point about it, then I'll go into the rest of my presentation. Hamilton said this in Federalist 11: "The world may be politically as well as geographically divided into four parts, each having a distinct set of interests. Unhappily for the other three, Europe, by her arms and her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has in different degrees extended her dominion over them all. Africa, Asia, and America have successively felt her dominion. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as the mistress of the world, and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Facts have too long supported the arrogant pretensions of the European. It belongs to us, Americans," he's writing to people considering ratifying the Constitution, "it belongs to us to vindicate the honor of the human race and to teach that assuming brother moderation," that European brother. He needs to be taught moderation. "Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world." Let's read that passage because I think it suggests something that's true about Hamilton, which is he's a kind of nationalist, not in the sense of like disordered, insane 20th century nationalism, but in the sense of he wanted his country to be a great power, right? He felt that it and other countries had been humiliated by European power, and he wanted to set up a situation where that would no longer be the case. And I think that's one of the big aims of his Treasury program. So as our first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton proposed this set of policies that he thought were essential to completing the founding, or finally bringing into existence in a full sense the kind of government promised by the Constitution. And before I tell you about the specific policies, let me explain a bit more about what I mean by completing the founding. For Hamilton, the promise of the Constitution was energetic government. We tried unenergetic government, or even more properly say, unenergetic non-government under the Articles of Confederation. That did not work out. It was a failure. If America wanted to be a prosperous, safe, and powerful nation, and if the Union was even to hold together at all, we needed a more powerful government that would be equal to the needs of the country. Hamilton also thought, however, that the government created by the Constitution was only potentially energetic. The powers were there, but they would have to be exercised energetically to bring into existence the kind of government, and also the kind of society that Hamilton thought America needed. So Hamilton wanted to bring about this completion by means of three main policies: provision for the public debt first, the National Bank second, and then a program for promoting American manufacturing third. So let me talk first about the report on public credit. When Hamilton came into office as Secretary of the Treasury, he faced a formidable problem: how to provide for America's large public debt. And that debt had been incurred mostly to pay for the costs of the Revolutionary War and gone mostly unpaid since the end of the Revolution, because the government, under the Articles of Confederation, could not command the resources necessary to pay it. It was expected that the new government would make some provision for the debt, but it fell to Hamilton to come up with a specific plan and to try to get it enacted by Congress. So he offered this plan in his famous Report on Public Credit. And again, while Report on Public Credit sounds like technical matter, Hamilton made it clear in that report that he thought he was engaged in an act of high statesmanship. He thought big things were at stake for the country in a proper provision for the debt. In the first place, a simple matter of justice, which requires that we repay what we have borrowed, right? In general, the founders are very earnest about the right to private property and hence the integrity of contracts. And Hamilton's very clear in that report and elsewhere that he thought these rules of morality apply to governments as well as to individuals, these elementary rules of good conduct. So governments have to pay their debts as well as individuals. It's interesting to me in reading that report and thinking about it that Hamilton, throughout the whole report, never even ventures the suggestion that the government could justifiably find a way to finagle its way out of the debts or to just write the debts off and tell the creditors, you have to take one for the team. After all, this was a war for our independence. You just got to pay up, right? He didn't treat it that way. He thought the government had an obligation to repay the debt somehow. In light of those considerations, I think you could view this as an attempt to complete the founding. What I mean is the founders understood one of the prime purposes of government to protect property, to secure the integrity of contracts. And so if it had begun its life by trampling upon those obligations, that would be a failure and an important respect. Hamilton had another, though, more practical aim in mind as well. He believed that properly energetic government required an ability on the part of the government to borrow money. Governments are meant to last forever, and ordinarily, if they're successful, they at least last for a long time. And in the course of their long lives, they encounter these exigencies, which is a word he uses very often, unforeseen things that cost money to pay for. And so a competent government, or a government that's equal to its tasks, needs to be able to borrow money. And the founders saw this. That's why the power to borrow money is enumerated in the Constitution. Congress has power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. But as a student of public finance, Hamilton was well aware, as probably we are or should be aware, that a mere legal power to borrow money is not in itself equal to a practical power to borrow money. You need to have a good credit rating, right? Then as now, both for individuals and governments, before people lend you money, they check to see how reliable they think you are. So Hamilton saw that a sound provision for the public debt was essential to the government's ability to borrow money on good terms. If you have a good credit rating, lenders will lend you money more easily. If you have a bad credit rating, they charge you a higher rate of interest as a way of protecting themselves against the real risk that you won't pay them back. And that happens to governments as well. So Hamilton thought that the newly established government was going to have to make a sound provision so that it could then guarantee that moving forward, credit would be available on good terms. And that, again, is essential to energetic government. If you encounter these exigencies, you want to be able to borrow money quickly and at a low rate of interest. And there's one particular aspect of this plan that I want to make sure to mention because it was the source of the first controversy between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton included in his plan for the public debts a plan to assume or take responsibility for the state, some of the state Revolutionary War debt. Just like today, public debt was a complex thing at the time of the founding. It's comprised of both federal government's debts, the state government debts. And Hamilton wanted Congress to enact a plan that would take responsibility on the part of the federal government for paying the state debts. And he wanted that for three reasons. He thought it would be fair, he thought it would be efficient, and he thought it would be politically beneficial. So let me explain those 3 points. He thought it would be fair because, as far as he was concerned, the debt of the states had been incurred in the course of the Revolution. That was an exertion for the whole country's independence, and so it would be just for the whole country to take responsibility for them. There are other arguments that could be made about that point, and they were made against him, but I'll just lay out his position on that for the moment. He thought it would be efficient because he thought it would be better to have one system of taxation paying down one big debt rather than 14 different jurisdictions if you have 13 states in the federal government with competing systems of taxation working against each other. So to that extent, he thought assumption would unburden the national economy because it would be simpler. And finally, he thought it would be politically beneficial because he reasoned that in a new government, which is an uncertain proposition, it would be useful if the moneyed classes were strong supporters of the federal government. And they will be more likely to be so if they, being creditors, are getting paid by the federal government. In other words, he worried that if the federal government didn't take over the state debts, there would be competing interests at stake, and those who were creditors and who were afraid they wouldn't get paid by their states would not support the plan and the system for paying off the national creditors. So it's better if we put everybody on the same plan, everybody benefits, and then again, that kind of wealthy class is then bound by self-interest to the federal government because they're not going to get repaid if they don't get repaid by the federal government. Federal government doesn't succeed, that's a harm to their interests. So he wanted to attach them to the federal government in that way. we talk about the report on a national bank. This is the second important step in his Treasury program, which he also thought was necessary to completing the founding. In general, Hamilton noticed that big, powerful commercial nations had national banks, and he thought America should follow their example if it wanted to achieve their success. More specifically, he thought the bank was another important link in this chain of establishing the government's power to borrow money and thus to be energetic. A real power to borrow requires not only your good credit rating, but also the presence of effective lenders. For purposes of private lending, that's maybe not such a big problem. There's always wealthy people around who want to try to make money by lending at interest. But for a government, which may need to borrow a lot of money in a short amount of time, you need something more. Hence his desire to create a national bank with big pot of capital from which the government could borrow at need. And he viewed that, I should also add, really as a matter of national security, precisely because of its ability to facilitate government borrowing. Wars are hard to predict, but they do happen in the course of time. And I think that would be one of the things about Hamilton's worldview, is he thinks war is an ineluctable part of the human condition. It's going to happen. We have to be prepared for it at all times. And when they happen, you need a lot of resources in a hurry, and a government that can borrow is going to be in a better position to win in a war. You can't raise the money you need through taxation quickly enough, nor could you do it through, say, borrowing from small lenders. So again, it's good to have this big institution with a lot of money from which the government can borrow. And then finally, he did also think the national bank would be useful as facilitating the government's ordinary financial transactions. The national bank, you have a place where you can deposit federal revenues. You have a place where people can, it'll float a paper currency as well, which people can use to pay their taxes without the inconvenience of transporting metals around the country and things like that. He also did think that, as part of his analysis of America's political economy at the time, was that there was a currency shortage which depressed the value of land and led to other problems. So if we can create a national bank that floats a paper currency based upon its metal deposits, then you have more currency, which can be used to make the economy run better and correct some of these disorders that had arisen as a result of the Revolutionary War. Finally, let me talk about his report on manufactures, which many scholars consider to be his greatest state paper, and many people have focused upon it as one of the great state papers by any American statesman. It showed, I guess, a mastery of political economy that many of the founders didn't have. This was Hamilton's strong suit. And by the way, I'd just like to add here a little biographical note that how did Hamilton get in the position to be able to write the report on public credit and the report on manufacturers and other things? It took a lot of study, but one thing I just want to note is that when he was a soldier in the Continental Army, like as an aide to George Washington for most of the time, he carried around with him. So, I mean, this is when he was about the age of the people in the audience for the most part, right? Hamilton's carrying around with him Malachi Postlethwaite's Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce, right? Because he's trying to prepare himself to take on this serious responsibility at some point on behalf of the country. I mean, to some extent, he may have just been looking forward to being a commercial lawyer or something like that, but I think he also, from a very young age, saw himself as having pretensions to helping to run a great country or a potentially great country. So he's trying to prepare his mind for that from the youngest stages of his life. I think another reason the report on manufacturers is considered a great state paper is that people think, it's kind of common to think of it as laying out a vision for the kind of country that America became. That's a complicated story, but he sees America as potentially a great manufacturing economy, and it looks like it did become that at some point. So this is another reason people have fixated on it. Let me tell you a little bit about the argument that's relevant for my purposes here. The third step, right? Hamilton argued in the report on manufacturers that America, if it wants to realize its potential to be a great and powerful nation, needs to develop a manufacturing sector. And he was careful, since America was predominantly an agricultural country at the time, he's careful not to present this as an attack on agriculture. There's nothing wrong with agriculture. I'm just saying it's better to have both. Both of these sectors flourishing, and the country will be richer than it otherwise would be. He'd also, by the way, read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, as had many of the founders, so this is informing some of his thinking, although he departed from Smith on some things as well. But he made arguments like this: manufacturing will introduce a division of labor, which allows greater productivity, allows people to work in the winter, which farmers don't ordinarily do, so that we'll have more productivity during those periods of time. It introduces other people into productive ways of life. There's a couple of arguments he makes there that are interesting. He says manufacturing will contribute to the country's prosperity in part because it will indemnify the country against the economic vagaries that are faced by a single sector of the economy. In other words, there's a banner agricultural year in Europe that can cause hardship for America's agricultural economy, drive down the price of agricultural goods. So it's better if we produce more than one set of things because then it'll stabilize the economy over time. The prosperity of one sector will make up for the hardships of another over time. There's also this interesting argument to me by way of political psychology where he makes the claim that a diverse economy will call forth more energy from the people because not everybody's suited to the agricultural way of life. Some people find that stultifying. And if they're bored, they're not going to work very hard. But if they have these other opportunities to do different things, their lives will be more energetic and there'll be more production. One thing that occurred to me, I just float this out there for a minute, is it's actually very similar to an argument that's made by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, which is strange because I think of Hamilton as being a much more authoritarian kind of guy than Mill, but this argument that Mill made with a view to kind of like individual liberty, Hamilton was sort of thinking of an analogous argument in terms of having a lot of choices in life as far as how you make your living. I want to make this other point before I wrap up here in a moment. So Hamilton, like all the founders, believed in the right to property, as I said earlier. He believed in free markets. He wanted America to have a thriving commercial and manufacturing economy. So to that extent, you could say, well, he's a capitalist. There's a certain truth in that, but I like to point out, if you read the report on manufacturers, you see he's not a pure laissez-faire man. He didn't think it was simply the job of the government to stay out of the economy and let it develop according to its own impulses, but he thought there's a constructive way for the government to intervene and guide the national economy. So in the report, Hamilton noted this free market argument that American manufacturing surely will develop at the proper rate according to market forces if you just leave it alone. And he said, well, that's generally true in theory, but in reality it's not the case because other countries don't let their manufacturing sectors develop according to free market principles, but they do things to protect them and to promote them, and they put our manufacturers at an artificial disadvantage. To some extent, it's the result, he said, of the fact that these other countries have more experience in manufacturing and more developed manufacturing sectors, but he said, in other cases, it's because their governments do things to weight the scales in favor of their own manufacturers. And in light of all that, he thought it was prudent for America to take some steps to promote manufacturing, which he thought was essential, again, not only to American prosperity, but to American security. He thought again about the potential for war and thought the country needs to have within itself all of the essentials of national supply. So it doesn't have to rely on foreign countries for what it needs to conduct warfare if war should come. And this leads into constitutional disputes as well, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about. You could raise the question, like, how do you promote your own manufacturing sector? One obvious way, it's in the news today, is through tariffs, right? And Hamilton mentioned that, but he says, I think a more direct and effective way is through bounties, or what we might call government subsidies, paid to American manufacturers. And he thought that could be done under the General Welfare Clause or the Spending Clause of the Constitution. And that proved to be a source of major contention, even though his plan in the report on manufacturers, another kind of irony about it is Congress didn't really enact that plan immediately. There's later on more effort, I think, to promote manufacturing, but the plan for the public credit, the plan for the bank, Congress did enact those. For the most part, they did not enact what's in the report on manufacturers, but the arguments that he made were extremely provocative and caused a lot of consternation on the part of Jefferson and Madison. And so I guess I'll conclude here and hand it off to my colleague by saying that each of these steps, which I've described, I guess, on their own merits as the way Hamilton saw them, were also steps that led to the progressive alienation of him from Jefferson and also Madison, and opened up this clash of two different political parties that emerged in the 1790s. Jefferson, objected to the assumption, but was able to live with it. He didn't think the bank should be done and didn't like it for a long time thereafter, and he really disliked what Hamilton had said, and especially the constitutional theory that's put forward in the report on manufacturers in defense of those subsidies. So what started as a kind of disagreement ends up being this sort of irreparable breach by the time you get to the end of Hamilton's floating out his proposals.
All right, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. I marked the time when Ms. Hamilton reportedly spoke at one point in the speech at the Constitutional Convention for 6 hours. And in the end, was given this rousing ovation. So it was the best speech that either of us has Hamilton. So we're going to stick to the 20 minutes and get away free. What I want to sort of kind of give a suggestion, even just as sort of the drama of the level of antiquity and hate that Jefferson and Hamilton had to each other. Then go back and sort of think a little bit about why Jefferson would got to that point. So, as Holloway pointing out, these reports, they happened very quickly in the space of about 2 years. And the first report was out 1790, and the manufacturers was at the end of 1791. So this hatred happens very, very quickly. And by early 1792, I think it's fair to say that Jefferson, Madison was well known to talk about Jefferson. Jefferson was convinced that Hamilton was really not a secret British agent and pro-monarchist seeking to restore monarchy. And Hamilton was beginning to suspect that Jefferson, maybe on his best day, was merely a dupe and pawn of radical anti-Christian French revolutionaries who would likely bring a guillotine to Philadelphia if they could. So there is absolutely no sense among either of these two men that there can be any kind of compromise or common ground as early as 1792-93. It only gets more intense in the antiquity goes from there. So what I want to do a little bit today is sort of just how they could have gotten to this point and why Jefferson is so convinced that the very worst version of Hamilton is the one that people should take seriously. And I think the way to do that is to step back a little bit and talk about just briefly. I'll only have to assert that it was 17 I don't have the time to lay out that this is in fact true. But to sort of assert that for this generation, the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence were actually very unexpected. They came of age as young men, believing they would live within a very highly functioning and highly effective British Empire that they were proud of being part of. And in fact, as you go over the course of the 18th century, from 1700 to around 1760, and you measure any trend you want to measure, politically, socially, culturally, economically, religiously, what you see is the 13 American colonies becoming more tightly integrated into a more effective British Empire, becoming more happy about the integration, and beginning to consciously think of themselves as British subjects. And to be a British subject in the 18th century is to be it's a very good deal. If you're a British subject in the 18th century, you begin to become, in many ways, quite self-impressed, quite arrogant about how much better you have it than the awful French Catholics and the awful Spanish Catholics. If you're a British subject, you think that you have the rights of life and liberty and property. You think that you have a superior form of monarchy that originated in what's literally called a glorious revolution at the end of the 17th century. A form of monarchy that's limited in its power and authority, that's subject to the rule of law, that actually is subject to accountable legislative bodies like the House of Commons and Parliament. There's all sorts of wonderful things you get to have because you're British. And all through the height of this British Empire, which comes with its achievements in the 70 years war, globally, the United States was the French Union. A war in which by 1763 the British Empire, with the full assistance of North American colonies, reached its strongest and its highest point. At that point in 1763, when all these men we know as sort of middle-aged founding father revolutionaries are sort of coming of age young adults, the British Empire reached its highest and most successful point with a great deal of voluntary and exciting cooperation and assistance from North American colonists. And then, for reasons that we don't have time to get into, but take courses here, or take courses at the University of Maryland, between 1763 and 1776, the entire world changed. All of this was destroyed. And they were forced to think very differently about Britain and the British Empire going forward. What had been an agent of liberty, an agent of protection of rights, a guarantee of the right kinds of British values, seemed to suddenly become an agent of tyranny. It was doing things to them suggesting that British people living in Britain didn't think that North American colonists were British subjects in the city, didn't deserve the same sort of rights, weren't equal. And so one of the nagging questions that a lot of people like Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and all those are all asking as they're sort of in their early 20s and 30s and thinking about really awesome task of becoming revolutionaries is why did Britain become around? Why did the society that we thought was the that knew exactly how to balance liberty, order, protect property, and have energetic government, a government that didn't become overly overbearing and dominant, and really seemed to have figured out its glorious revolution into the successful propagation of its values in the imperial system. Why did all of that fall apart? Why did it become some new source of tyranny? Really no different than against the absolutist Catholic French line. We were tricked, they said, to think there was some difference between the British and the French. There isn't. There's no distinction from. Why did that happen? And as Jefferson's trying to think about this, and he's thinking about it very seriously as he writes several pamphlets in the 1770s, he writes the British colonies, Declaration of Independence, of course. As he's thinking about this, what he did was he began to indict all of the developments of the 18th century that he initially thought were sources of liberty, but he came to conclude were in fact sources of tyranny. And in many ways, for Jefferson, the American Revolution was very much a quarrel with the mainstream of the 18th century. And the things that he identified with that mainstream 18th century were a lot of the sorts of developments that Hamilton later looked to embrace as important to the American Revolutionary Party. So how did Jefferson explain to himself why he came to that? He said, well, it really came to that because in order to defend its glorious revolution over the course of the 18th century, it became a state that existed to borrow money and make it. And essentially, the glorious revolution of 1689 sets off a century of warfare. Between 1689 and 1815, you can really take it up that far, the wars of the French Revolution. Britain and France were either at war during an entire period of time or preparing to be at war. And the way in which Britain financed these wars over the course of the 18th century was to pioneer the process of public government and borrowing. And so the British create, I'll say it's a little complicated. So the way to do it is governments can borrow before this revolution. So the British essentially create modern deficit government borrowing in the 1690s with something called the £1 million Act. This is a million British pounds. And by 1815, at the end of the wars, that British debt grew up to over £8 billion. So in a century period, you can sort of chart this debt becoming something that is actually 2.5 times, by the end, servicing the debt is 2.5 times the entire British gross domestic product. We're worried that right now that we might in the next few years get a debt that would be 100% of our gross domestic product. In other words, our entire economy will be required to pay interest on debt. That's sort of uncharted, almost uncharted waters. So think about the British in 1815 being at 215%. So one thing that Jefferson says is what happens when the nations are organized to borrow money from countries. One thing is that he creates is large centralized states that control huge amounts of cash. And what he identifies in Britain is this is the society that he thought was what liberty in fact used all of this massive amount of spending to begin to corrupt its political institutions. And so Jefferson identifies in very clear ways, and he uses a lot of radical British thinkers who are saying the same thing in the 18th century. He identifies clear methods that he associates with mainstream British policymakers for how they used debt and the debts that come from fighting wars to turn institutions like the British Parliament into mouthpieces for a dangerous and increasingly tyrannical king. And literally, we would identify this British statesman named Robert Wall. And I'll often compare Hamilton to the American Wall. This is like Robert Wall. And what Walpole and people in this tradition would do is, as they borrowed more money to fight wars, what they realized was that borrowing money generates an immense amount of money that has to be spent. You borrow money and you spend it on building ships and making guns and making uniforms, start hanging on military grades and armaments. One great historian in this period said in the 18th century, this British state drove the economy rather than the economy driving the states. It's powerful war-making borrowing states. It's central to all the economic activity. And what Walpole would do is he would essentially go to members of the House of Commons and say, well, look, if you vote for the taxes that will allow us to have money to borrow and maintain these wars, I'll deliver certain purveyance contracts to you. I'll have your district build, get a contract to build a ship, ships for the Navy. It was called patronage. And in a sense, Walpole had so much patronage at his disposal that he could actually dole out patronage to the majority of the members of the House of Commons in England, and therefore essentially rely upon them always voting for his policies. And as Jefferson is trying to grapple with how Britain becomes tyrannical, he points to things like this. He says, well, look, at that point, as members of Parliament become so dependent on receiving patronage, in fact, the districts are reliant upon continuing to vote for leaders who will bring this river of passion and affection. They're no longer capable of actually judging the value of the policies they're voting on. They simply depend upon the outcome of those policies too much to be able to actually make independent judgments about. And as these members of the House of Commons who are supposed to be independent of the king, independent of the king's judgments at all, become dependent on their salaries, essentially, on the king and his agents, then the institutions of the look like they're free, and look like they're capable of standing separately and independently and making judgments about central authority, just become instruments and mouthpieces of that central authority. Jefferson's way, as H.L. Mencken, early 20th century political analyst, said, I had a wonderful line one day where he said, it's very difficult to get a man to understand something because paycheck depends upon him not understanding. Jefferson's way is that's Walpole all over. None of these, all these entities, their paychecks depend upon not understanding us. So he points to things like that, and he says, well, okay, so we can now identify the agents of corruption, the sources of corruption, the ways in which a once great political system, cared for, was born in liberty, becomes corrupt and degenerates into a point where it treats us like it began to treat us in 17th century. You see a society that is organized around vast public interests. You see a society that is trying to take advantage of these new forms of wealth that generate the kind of ability to borrow money. You see a society that is wars war stimulates the need to borrow. And if you're identifying a state that wants to do those things, what you're identifying is a state that's creating a modern version of tyrannical order. You don't even have to have a hereditary action of kings, as Jefferson. You look for these forms, these institutions, these sinews of power as well as this power. And if you see those things, you see a society that's moving towards monarchy, regardless of what it might say. And so, in certain ways, when we look through what Hamilton did in the early 1790s, had he been consciously trying to do so, he couldn't have perceived it. They were more likely to terrorize Jefferson. This is exactly the sort of thing Jefferson said that led the British monarchy, who once cared for liberty, to become an instrument of tyranny. And here we try to escape from it. In fact, the declared independence that was real estate, we didn't escape from it. We got back in rational violence to it. And then the first thing that happens once we get independence is the Hamilton tries to import these British values on the sphere. And he may, for the best of reasons, Jefferson says, think that they can maintain by Republican politics, Republican culture, but in reality, they will simply destroy Republican politics. The same toxic effect that they had. We've already seen how society degenerates through these forms, and this will happen here as well. And so, this is Jefferson well part of it. What should we do if not that? This is the mainstream we consider. This is how modern societies are powerful. This is how modern societies work. What we're saying as Jefferson is we have to depart from the mainstream we consider modern. That seems kind of crazy. What could replace it? What could be an alternative? And Jefferson's conception of what can happen instead of this 18th century instead of imitating Britain, was essentially to create a Republican vision of society that was almost a point-by-point representation of what Britain had become at the time, and what he thought Hamilton was trying to recreate in America. So what Jefferson did was he started off with the reality of a huge and vast landmass, vast North American continent. And he decided not to be very troubled by the fact that there were already all sorts of civilizations and peoples living on that land. And what he said was, we have the possibility of these material realities of this vast landmass to be something fundamentally different. In Great Britain, they need efficiency. They need manufacturing. They need all the things that Adam Smith talks about because people can't get access to land. And therefore, they have to go into other sorts of occupations. He said, well, Adam Smith is talking about how it generates wealth of nations. Adam Smith also talks about the terrible effects that has on each person. So one of the big examples that Smith uses in the wealth of nations, that Jefferson wants to utilize, is the image of the pinwheel effect, which Smith talks about the division of labor as people spend their time making things repetitive tasks into the pinwheel. And Smith himself is horrified, he says, by the kind of psychological damage that's done with repetitive, dull, drudging labor. And Jefferson is even more concerned because he says, we are going to depend upon each of these individuals more than they will in monarchies and republic. Our political institutions will only be as good and sound as the health and mental soundness of the citizens themselves. Can we afford to have drudging, repetitive pinwheels working in dull, stultifying labor? Another good example that Jefferson's very concerned about, also in manufacturing, this is an example of the favorite of his colleges, is an example of the shoebuckle makers of Birmingham, a city in England. And during the 18th century, it was a highly skilled class of artisans who still produced fine buckles for shoes. And in the 18th century, the style changed. It stopped being shoes. shoeboxes, and instead learned to make rivets and buttons. And an entire class of skilled labor was thrown out of work. And Madison learned about this because they had to petition King George III reported. And so Madison spends a lot of time talking about this with the plight of the shoebox workers. He says, can they be Republican citizens? Because they can be good and virtuous men. I'm sure they care for their wives and their children. I feel for that. But if they're so dependent upon the whims of fashion, as essays call fashion, on the fickle desires of wealthy people, what they buy to use for their shoes, they can never be trusted with the right to vote or on responsibility. Because they're so dependent on the choice of voters that if those people threaten them with other choices, say we're going to stop buying your buttons and instead we just stop buying these slippers, shoe-buckle makers will do anything they can to keep business, including giving their votes to them. And so to entrust men like that with the right to vote is simply to give the very powerful more political power to voters. And this is particularly the essay analysis as Jefferson agrees. What never goes out of style? Eating, says he. Eating never goes out of style. No fickle fashion will make grain less desirable, grain less needed. And so what Jefferson and Madison are saying is that what we need to do is in many ways create the anti-hero, move across the space of the economy, recreating a world of independent agricultural farming families who are producing necessities rather than superfluous qualities of shoeboxes and other kinds of legends, and create that as the fundamental foundation and basis for a good Republican society. And he said the way to judge decent and good states in pursuit of public good is do you observe their policies moving you further away from the example we already have evidence is true. If you follow the formulas of Britain, no matter what political domain you give it, you are practicing using the institution of monarchy to create a corrupt and tyrannical system. And the only way to escape from this trap is to create something that is ultimately a reputation of the world and create an entirely different political economy based upon the material opportunities that exist in North America. And because they exist here and nowhere else in Jefferson, let us be criminally insane not to take advantage of them, to provide for a wider population of people the opportunity to live outside of what can only become corrupt and degraded and tyrannical political and social and economic circumstances. So for him, he couldn't probably imagine having doing greater damage to the spirit of the American Revolution. And so what Hamilton sees is a very good system, I think a very good system to create a more stable society and a more stable and powerful government. To keep other governments in a community nation which is often violent. Jefferson sees it as a willful effort to try to recreate the institutions of monarchy and impose the same sort of tyrannical assault upon American citizens that would have happened had they not fought the revolution. At that point, what would 1776 and 4 were Hamilton's ideas of the system to take root. The interesting thing is that in the short term, Jefferson loses today. Hamilton and Federalist Party do lose. And one thing I'll throw out here is one of the reasons why they keep winning is because all of the little craftsmen and manufacturers in Pennsylvania and New York all end up voting for Thomas Jefferson. They don't vote for the man who voted for the man. That's an interesting question. While Hamilton's associated with manufacturing, the guys who are actually doing the manufacturing and then voting for the man who wants to lay the foundation for the global economy and then learning the world. So in the end, just to sort of sum up in 5 minutes, for Jefferson, the only option available is to try everything he can to stop what he's convinced is the recreation of Britain under the guise of a Republican polity, laying claim to the American Revolution spirit of 1776, which he doesn't really want to.
Starting to get a better idea than I had before about why there might be a flip-flop in the American Party system and how they regard these two figures. Potentially, if Jefferson, within his time, represented looking to the past and what we might call a reactionary view, resisting trends toward industrialization, urbanization, public debt. In other words, the fiscal and military state of the day, modernizing, represented by the British Empire. If Jefferson looks kind of reactionary, then Hamilton looks kind of progressive. And in that sense, you might think, well, no wonder that Hamilton could become a hero of the left. He seemed progressive for his own time. And Jefferson seemed sort of reactionary. And so Jefferson should be the hero of the right. But on the other hand, there was something else that the speakers brought up that might go the other way, and that has to do with the role of economic elites in society. And typically we assume that the political left is sort of hostile to economic elites and wants to keep them at bay. Corporations are not people, and overturn Citizens United and get money out of politics and things like that. So we associate hostility to economic elites with the political left. But that seems more like Jefferson's position in the late 18th century. And Hamilton seems more friendly to top-down politics. And let the bankers and the entrepreneurs and the creative forces, the modernizing forces, run the show. And so there's some interesting ingredients there that could take us in different directions. Thank you for indulging my moderator's discretion. Now it is my task to take questions from the audience. Yes, sir, Dr. Croft.
This is kind of a superficial, silly question, but I was just wondering, Jefferson and Hamilton, these two giant intellectual figures in our history and so on, hated each other and believed the things about each other that they do believe. What do we have today? It just strikes me as despairing that we would think that these people that we see as transcendent in some sense in terms of our government and American politics would be so unable to resolve this, both while being, you might say, great patriots in their own way. So are we again at that same precipice as we see our two parties moving further apart from each other in ideological terms? But you may not want to talk about it.
So I can give you an answer that starts off hopeful, but then doesn't end hopeful. So, because
did I have it reversed?
Yeah. It would have been more hopeful maybe 3 years ago. So one thing I would say is that I think that we don't want to I don't think we need to be too despairing about what is in fact this absolute antipathy, because it's very much a way in which 18th century people are thinking in minorities. So what they all believe is that there is this tangible, noble public good that you can articulate, that you can pursue, and that you can achieve. And since they're constantly know what it is, it's literally impossible for them to imagine how they're going to loyal or useful opposition. If you are in opposition, you're opposing the party good. And so there must be done for sinister and interested reasons. What they don't have, and which and this is where a couple of things, which in American history we do develop, is a sense that there is a pluralism, that people can legitimately have different needs and interests, that we shouldn't all reasonably expect to get everything we want, and that therefore part of the useful modern liberal democratic, small liberal democratic process is to be deliberative and to engage in sort of compromising power politics and to cross the line. And I think that even up into my lifetime, I was born in 1970, I would say we kind of had politics. And so what I used to do when I used to do lectures on this period is I would be able to draw very clear distinctions between what I would say is not a real party system. You can't have a party system until you imagine you can live, you'll survive if you have a party. Then you have a system of politics where you're all agreeing on the same things, you're all engaged in the same kind of, you're all agreeing sort of where the broad matters are, and you argue about particular community. They didn't do that, but that's an 18th century way of thinking. We developed that, and that's really good. However, I no longer feel, when I still try to make those points, my students become less convinced. And I say, well, that doesn't look like a party system that I want, and I kind of have to relate to that. So I'm having much more trouble now showing how a modern political party system that we're supposed to work in is different from the 18th century So we need to do something about that. But I don't think we need to despair just because Hamilton, in fact, in many ways, there's no way Hamilton Jefferson could have acknowledged legitimacy.
Yes.
What national politicians today would the speakers believe come closest to sharing the overall viewpoints of Hamilton and Jefferson?
That's a tough one. There is a way, I don't want to speak to Jefferson. This picks up on the contemporary situation. I'm not going to take a side on this, but there is a way, and this relates also to what Mr. Malloy was raising about
the current situation of the parties in relation to Jefferson and Hamilton. And this is a dangerous business because we don't know what Jefferson and Hamilton would say if they were here, right? Because they had to operate in the world they lived in, and you don't know what judgments they would make about what the common good requires if they were totally different circumstances now. That being said, it seems to me that the character of the Republican Party today is very questionable because it had been in the past more Hamiltonian. It became more Jeffersonian, at least rhetorically. And that's another important difference. It's the kind of broad principles people articulate versus what they're willing to put up with. Right? The Republican Party in the post-New Deal era sort of presented itself in some ways as the Jeffersonian Party. If you read by Jefferson, I'm no friend of energetic government. It always is oppressive. He said something like that. He believes in strict limitations on the federal power. This is something that's very interesting to me, and I talk a lot about, but we didn't actually bring up in our discussions, like the differences in constitutional interpretation and how modern Republicans in the last 50 years have wanted to use narrow interpretations of federal power to suggest that a more extensive role of the government in the economy is not just imprudent, but unconstitutional, right? Jefferson was a pioneer of the narrow interpretation of the federal power, and Hamilton was a partisan of the broader interpretation. So that's the way things were when I was growing up. But then, yeah, with the current president, leaving aside all the controversies that might arise from his personality and his combative style, in terms of his policy substance, in some ways he does sound Hamiltonian because he believes in promoting manufacturing, he's in favor of high tariffs. I mean, these are complicated questions. Well, we've talked about that, yeah, but the big difference, though, we don't want to go on this too long. I mean, Hamilton is definitely not a populist, right? So to the extent that Trump is kind of a populist or makes a populist feel like Hamilton like that. But in terms of this idea that if you read the Federalist Papers, Hamilton clearly regards the world of international commerce as a realm of great power competition, where it's not just individuals and corporations cooperating, but it's nations trying to make themselves powerful. I think Trump has that kind of agonistic view of international relations. It's a power struggle among nations. And the idea, too, that, yeah, foreign policy in general is about nations trying to advance their national interests. I mean, that's a kind of Hamiltonian view. But then, I'm talking too long, but yeah, so a lot of the conservatives in the Republican Party are appalled by Trump because he doesn't have the same concerns with limited governments. Like governments and forces should be used actively to promote certain ends. And that's a new thing for the Republican Party today. I mean, I suspect there's always been that kind of Republican, but the dominant heights of the Republican Party or the conservative movement did not emphasize that kind of thing. And so the rise of Trump suggests that there may be a new kind of right-wing politics that's not the conventional one. It's Hamiltonian in those senses that I mentioned.
I mean, the sort of the scholar's answer is to say that it's just really so difficult as to maybe not be helpful to try and draw these lines. I mean, because for one thing,
There's a lot of, I mean, I meet with a lot of people. I live in the East Coast, and I get asked to talk about Hamilton. So I encounter a lot of people from Wall Street, and there's a museum of finance on Wall Street, dedicated to Hamilton that a couple of guys started that I know, and so they really like him. On the other hand, Hamilton is for the 18th century, is the most vigorous advocate for national power and state intervention, which Wall Street has very little interest in today. So how you and so they often have trouble reconciling. He's so pro-business and yet he's so pro-government. I say, well, that's just because the 18th century is fundamentally different, and he's not talking to you. So why you don't get to pick and choose and use him. But it's interesting in the 30s, when FDR is really saying I'm a Jeffersonian, but also he's creating the New Deal. And so his famous phrase is, we're going to use Hamiltonian ends to produce Hamiltonian means to produce Jeffersonian ends, right? And we'll just mix them together. And that's maybe more accurate for how in the modern, I mean, he's closer to us than obviously they are. If you want to try and sort of make use of them, in the modern world, you can't take them whole. You have to pick off the bits you like because they just don't correspond to our modern political arrangements. I mean, my God, I think Hamilton's emphasis on sort of the natural aristocracy and the great, sober, responsible statesman, and then, the Donald Trump,
right.
I don't think he would be happy with that at all. So I think it's very difficult to sort of look, I mean, there's the way in which our modern political arrangements have developed. We're just simply not asking their questions or thinking their thoughts. I mean, the way I conclude my book is I say, none of their answers are our answers, and can be our answers, but they did ask a lot of questions that we should probably be also trying to ask. We're going to come up with different answers than we must, but they had some good questions, and we shouldn't lose sight of them, is how I would put it.
It's hard to imagine Hamilton on Twitter,
Yeah.
Attacking Jefferson.
Yeah.
I think
It's easy
you just
to
gave someone a book idea.
Yeah. It's easy to imagine though some of the higher newspaper pens Jefferson used attacking Hamilton on Twitter without any trouble.
Well, I mean, Hamilton would tweet something like, Jefferson is a man of, what is it, a fanatic in politics and an atheist in religion.
Yeah.
Sad.
Sad. Yeah. Jefferson has a womanish attachment to France. Sad.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question about this idea of Jefferson's that industrial labor is deadening, and therefore you want to get back to agricultural work. But that's somehow more stimulating. But what about how that fits with the reality of slavery? Were they really farmers?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
weren't actually doing that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things so one of the things that's so interesting is that so Hamilton has a deep, deep mistrust of the American citizenry that fought the Revolution. Jefferson, on some fundamentally much more comfortable trusting them. And I think part of the reason is because he lives in a society, 18th century Virginia, where very rarely for the 18th century, as a wealthy white man, he does not need to make use of and exploit the labor of poorer white men, because he is so deeply exploiting the labor of non-white peoples. And because this is Edmund Morgan's classic argument, American slavery and American freedom, and therefore he can actually imagine poorer white men as productive, almost independent and equal citizens, because he doesn't need to make use of them. So what I would argue is that, in fact, the fact of slavery is embedded and enmeshed absolutely from the start in his conceptions of being able to imagine a more broadened and democratic citizenry. And we can't really think about American democracy without realizing that at the start, the capacity of people like Jefferson to think in those terms is because slavery is there. It's not something that's sort of, peripheral or an aberration. It's right there in the midst. And if we're going to think about how our democracy works, we have to think that from the start, it was based upon racial degradation and racial subordination.
And therefore that would have to continue.
Well, what's interesting is that in the late 18th century, they are deeply troubled by that, right? So Jefferson has all these circumlocutions about why he's convinced that naturally over time, slavery is going to become less and less significant and disappear. And to some extent, it's not entirely unreasonable, because he's looking at this tobacco-based Chesapeake slavery, that it does actually decline in the 19th century. But he doesn't die until 1826. So he lives long enough to see the rise of what we call a second slavery, and he's still saying the same things he was saying in 1785. So he never confronts the fact that, it's very clear, there's no doubt, abstractly and intellectually, Jefferson says, slavery is absolutely toxic to Republican institutions. He says, not necessarily because he cares at all about slaves, but because he thinks of the way in which it encourages in owner and masters the desire for mastery and power. And he says that they'll take that into the Republican public sphere, they'll expect it everywhere, they won't be able to learn and inculcate decent Republican values. So he's very worried about the effect that slavery will have on people who own slaves. But he has all these crazy ideas for, therefore, how to deal with slavery that end up simply only exacerbating and encouraging slavery. So he never can confront that issue. But I think in many ways his ability to be a slave owner is wrapped up with his capacity to imagine democratic politics.
Because of the dance party that has opened up just outside, I'm going to attempt. Is this on? Is this on? Hello? Hello?
We can just project more.
Yeah, we can talk
Okay,
about
maybe
it.
we'll just talk loud. The old-fashioned way. Call me a reactionary if you must. Yes, sir.
I was really struck in terms of the presentations. Hamilton is not talking about dull finance and these kinds of things. He's talking about the United States being this great nation among nations, right? And ways to kind of do that. But he's also talking about how to build this new nation, right? And Jefferson's also trying to think about how to build this new nation. But how is he thinking? As a former diplomat himself, how is he thinking about the United States as a nation among nations, and a powerful nation, maybe, maybe not, in that world when he's rejecting things like manufacturing, and he's suggesting that war is the reality, right?
Right.
Of the world that they inhabit. So,
Yeah.
how is he looking for the United States to become the
Sure.
powerful nation of the world?
So a number of things. So one thing is we don't want to see this as too binary. So Jefferson does not reject the idea of public credit. He vehemently rejects the ways in which Hamilton is putting use to public credit. So we didn't have time to talk about it. I'm sure Mr. Holloway would have. We didn't talk, for example, about how the debt has changed hands over the course of the 1780s, and how the way in which Hamilton structures the debt ends up being a huge boondoggle for a very small group of wealthy people at the expense of small landholding producers and farmers. He's terrified of that. So what Jefferson is saying is, he's like, look, what we need to do is we need to honor our obligations to foreign nations that have lent us money. Because the money markets of Amsterdam is where a nation goes to borrow anyway. That's a small fraction of the debt. And he's absolutely adamant. We have to be absolutely dependable with them, pay the interest, pay them off, no question at all. We will look to, he has a line at one point where he says, we need to have excellent credit so as to not have to be able to use it. If we can borrow to fight wars, people will be less inclined to want to fight wars with us. But then he gets back to, he really emphasizes the agricultural nature of the republic he wants to build, and this difference between what he sees as necessities, agriculture, grain never going out of style, and then superfluities. So in fact, what he says is, as a republican nation, we can remake the world and create a completely different framework for how nations interact with each other. And the culmination of this is his embargo and non-intercourse acts of 1807 and 1808, where he says, because we produce necessities, which they depend on more than we do, and we are, while they produce things that we would like to have but can live without, what we can do is peacefully coerce them into an international system of relations that will work for us by temporarily withholding things they can't live without. And that's what, and so he does these extraordinary things as president in 1807, 1808. He essentially suspends all international economic trade for 2 years, so, hoping to force Britain and France through peaceful means, because he's convinced that once you have to fight wars and once you have to do all the things that go with wars, that's the end of the game, right? Then you're borrowing, you're creating big states, you're creating, corrupt and tyrannical forms. So if you can, through peaceful means of embargo, peaceful means of sort of non-consumption, force these nations to essentially move into your orbit, then you can create a different and more peaceful and less violent international world order, where all these forms that are sort of
to some extent, Hamilton and Jefferson exaggerated the differences between themselves. And this matter of the debt, I think, is one that comes to my mind. Right, the debt that Hamilton was, Madison